Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to move our amendment to Lord's Amendment 51 and to support the other Lord's amendments that we're considering today. Can I start by thanking the other House for their work? And in particular, I'd like to record our thanks to our Labour Lords team, led by Baroness Hayter and Baroness Smith, who worked extremely hard to improve this bill. The amendments in this group this afternoon, as with yesterday, cover a number of crucial issues, such as enhanced protection for EU-derived rights, environmental safeguards, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. In many respects, that should not be controversial, and I'll return to those issues later on. But let me start, Mr Speaker, with Lord's Amendments 1 and 2. These amendments, if upheld here, would require a minister to lay before both Houses of Parliament a statement outlining the steps taken in the Article 50 negotiations to negotiate our continued participation in a customs union with the EU. Now, I don't suppose it's the making of a statement that the government objects to. It's the negotiation of a customs union with the EU. In fact, so determined is the government not to accept a customs union with the EU that it's gone to extraordinary lengths to dream up alternatives. When the so-called partnership agreement and the so-called maximum facilitation options first saw the light of day last summer, nobody really took them seriously. Not even the BrExit Secretary. Within 2 weeks, he was describing the customs partnership as blue sky thinking. Thus, when the Prime Minister resurrected them in her Mansion House speech earlier this year, many of us, including myself, were genuinely surprised. Since then, it's become increasingly apparent that neither option is workable, neither is acceptable to the EU, and neither will get majority support across this House. The Foreign Secretary calls the customs partnership crazy. The Business Secretary says the maximum facilitation option would cost thousands of jobs in manufacturing. No wonder a Cabinet Peace Summit is planned for July. So the proposal in Lord's Amendments 1 and 2 that the government should seek to negotiate a customs union with the EU as part of the future arrangement is a sensible one for many reasons. I will.
Is he prepared to accept free movement as the cost of a customs union, or isn't he?
I'll come to that issue, but I'm sure the honourable member is aware that free movement has nothing to do with a customs union. So first, Mr Speaker, I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Given the reports just now that Number 10 have rejected the agreement that was made yesterday with sensible Conservative MPs on the Grieve amendment, at least the third part of it, and there is no guarantee now, absolutely none, that there will be a meaningful vote. Is it not absolutely essential that a loud voice goes out from this House today that we want the least damaging Brexit possible in the customs union and in a single market?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I haven't seen the news that's just coming through, but if that is the news, it's extremely concerning, because a strong message needs to go out from this House about the proper role of Parliament in the Article 50 process, and arguing for the best possible outcome in terms of a close economic relationship with the EU. I'll give way. I've given way 3 times already, so I think accusing me of not giving way.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way, but I think we need to be very clear about this, because something may have happened, but I heard the Prime Minister standing at the dispatch box very clearly saying that an amendment would be forthcoming. It would largely incorporate much of the right honourable learned friend's amendment which he put forward yesterday, and discussions and negotiations are continuing, and in due course that amendment will be laid in the Lords, and if I may put it in this way, the job will be done on a meaningful vote and roll for this House.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I haven't seen whatever news is coming out, but I can say this, having observed the proceedings yesterday and the various interventions, it seemed to me very clear that what was being said, the right honourable gentleman who was putting forward the amendment yesterday, was very clear for us all to hear about the specific paragraphs that were of huge importance and what the proposed amendment in the Lords would contain. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see what the wording is, but from my point of view, observing, I thought it was pretty clear what was being said from the front bench about what was likely to happen in the course of next week. I will, but I have to say I wasn't anticipating spending the whole afternoon on reinterpreting yesterday, but let's see how we get on.
But doesn't my right honourable friend agree, though it was fun yesterday, the truth is, if this House wants a meaningful vote, there are ways and means by which we will have a meaningful vote, irrespective of what the legislation says.
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help noticing yesterday that as my honourable friend was spelling out, that at the moment the government's position is that should Article 50 be voted down, they guarantee that they'll make a statement within 28 days, was not particularly convincing, and the Brexit Secretary himself found that of some amusement. That is certainly not enough. What is needed is the opportunity for this House not only to vote on the Article 50 deal, but also to have an appropriate and proper role if the vote is to vote down the Article 50 deal. I'm afraid we're rehearsing yesterday's argument, but we voted on this side yesterday for the Lords Amendment, which would have given not only a meaningful vote, but the proper role for Parliament afterwards to decide what happens next.
The right honourable and learned gentleman is completely innocent in this matter, but he has almost unavoidably been diverted from the path of virtue as a result of interventions. And I simply want to remind not just the right honourable and gentleman, the House, that we are supposed to be focused on amendments that relate to the European Economic Area. What we must not do is have a replay of yesterday's proceedings. Well, that's very generous of the honourable gentleman, the member for Wantage. Well, right honourable gentleman, member for Wantage. Right honourable member for Wantage, I mean, well, my cup runneth over today. I'm having moral support from a sedentary position, both from the right honourable gentleman and from the right honourable lady, the member for Broxtowe, to boot. So it's clearly my lucky day. But I leave the right honourable lady gentleman to continue back.
Speaker, I will press on, make my case, and take some further interventions later on. Mr. Speaker, I was saying that the proposal in Lords Amendment 1 and 2 that the government should seek to negotiate a customs union with the EU as part of the future arrangements is a sensible one for many reasons. And the first is the economy. Over a number of decades, our manufacturing model has adapted to the arrangements we currently have with the EU, including the customs union. Thus, typically, we see across the UK thousands of manufacturing businesses that operate on the basis of a vital supply chain in goods and parts from across the EU. The car industry is an obvious example, but not the only one. They operate on the basis of a just-in-time approach. So whereas years ago there were stockpilings of parts, etc., these days it's just-in-time. Parts come in, they get assembled, and then the finished product goes quickly and seamlessly across the UK and or out to the EU. And that is the manufacturing model that we operate in this country and have done for many years. I know that across the House, MPs will know that that is what goes on in their constituencies. I will give way on that point.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. And does he agree with me that it's very concerning what the outgoing president of the CBI has said today, that sectors of manufacturing, in particular the car industry, would be severely damaged if the UK does not stay in a customs union with the EU?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. One of the risks of intervention is that the very next point you're about to make gets stolen. But the honourable member is absolutely right, because, and I'll just remind the House what the President of the CBI said this morning. What he said was this, and I quote, "If we do not have a customs union, there are sectors of manufacturing society in the UK which risk becoming extinct. Be in no doubt that is the reality." Mr. Speaker, this is at the heart of this debate. Destroy the model, the manufacturing model I've just described, and you destroy a vital part of the economy, and job losses will be considerable. And that is why there are such high levels of concern across the business community about the government's current approach. I will give way. Yeah.
Thank the right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. He's been very generous with his interventions today. Could he just tell the House on that particular issue, does he believe that Britain should remain in the EEA? Yes or no?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, Mr. Speaker. And for the benefit of the House, I'm going to go through the customs union argument. I'm then going to move on to the EEA and the single market, and then I've got other remarks that I'm going to make. So, if you'll forgive me, I'll deal with that when I get to the EEA. I am dealing with the customs union at the moment. I will give way on this.
Is Labour in favour of staying in the customs union or a customs union which approximates to a customs arrangement which would allow us to make free trade deals with other states apart from the EU, the customs union or a customs arrangement?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current customs arrangements are in the membership treaty. And therefore, if they're to be replicated, and if there's a customs union that's going to do the work of the current customs union, there needs to be a new treaty. And that's why we are in favour of a customs union, but a customs union that does the work of the customs union that we are currently in. And I think, although weeks and months ago this was a point of great heat and discussion, I think most people understand that there will have to be a new agreement that replicates and does the work of the current customs union. I'm going to make some progress, Mr. Speaker. I've taken a lot of interventions and I will take others later on. But the concern about the customs union is not confined to the business community. It extends inevitably to trade unions on behalf of those that they represent, to those who depend on the manufacturing sector, and to those who work in and operate our ports and places of entry and exit. And I myself have visited Dover to look at the operation there and to talk through with management and staff there the impact of any change to the current customs arrangements, and also at Holyhead, the second biggest port, where there are high levels of concern about that. I will give way because I indicated earlier I would.
I'm very grateful. I know he wants to separate out customs union from single market, but if you're talking about frictionless trade and just-in-time deliveries, you cannot separate those two things, because checks would be required not just for customs and rules of origin, but also for product regulations and conformity with standards. And is he therefore saying single market access would, refer to my honourable friend from Middle South and East Cleveland, is willing to accept free movement of people as the price of access to the single market?
Thank you. I do assure the honourable member I am going to come to the single market in the EEA and I'll deal with it there. But at the moment I'm making the case on the customs union. But I accept the proposition that the customs union on its own does not produce frictionless trade. The customs union on its own does not answer the question, how would you prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland? But I am going to specifically deal with that, and I'll obviously take further interventions at the time. I will give way.
Thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. Is my right honourable friend aware that the Dutch government and the European Commission have begun to advise businesses not to take car parts produced in the UK for export because of concerns of rules of origin? Today's proposals will address that?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I had heard that, and that's not an isolated example. There are other examples, and it's deeply troubling, which is why the amendments before the House today are so important. I'll take another intervention, then I will try to press on.
My right honourable friend, he's reminded the House already that the Cabinet hasn't made up its mind what sort of customs arrangement it wants. Is it his understanding, as it is mine, that the maximum facilitation option would entail infrastructure on the border in Northern Ireland, and so get us back to the hard border that everyone says we want to avoid?
Thank you. I think the main problem with maximum facilitation is it involves technology yet to be invented and certainly to be made to operate, and nobody knows quite what it is, whether it can be developed, and delivered, and if so, when? But just on the Northern Ireland border, because I will come to Northern Ireland yesterday, the commitment is to no infrastructure, no checks and no controls. And I will come to that point specifically when I deal with Northern Ireland. I'll take one more and then I really will move on.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. On maximum facilitation, he will be aware that the Permanent Secretary of HMRC indicated the cost will be £17 to £20 billion a year to implement it. And this information was shared across Whitehall, so ministers are well aware of it, and that would be damaging to our economy.
Yes, I did see that figure, and it's deeply concerning that those sorts of costs are even contemplated in relation to technology that has not been developed or invented in many respects for that option, which is why there's such a bitter dispute going on in the Cabinet about it. Mr Speaker, no, I am going to press on if you don't mind now. I will take other interventions later on. Mr Speaker, I realise that all sorts of fanciful promises were made during the referendum and since about new customs arrangements. But we have a duty, and this is the heart of the debate today, we've got a duty to protect our economy, to protect jobs and to protect the manufacturing sector across the UK. And the only way to uphold that duty is to negotiate a customs union with the EU. There is, of course, another important aspect. In December last year, our government made a solemn promise in the Phase 1 agreement. No hard border in Northern Ireland. And that was spelt out. No infrastructure, no checks and no controls. Now, in all the toing and froing yesterday, what may have been missed is that one of the amendments that in fact went through was an amendment to a Lord's amendment put forward by the government without any dissent on this side, that obligation should be legally binding in UK law. That is a very significant amendment, because we've now got a political commitment in December to no hard border, no infrastructure, no checks and no controls. We have a binding law to that effect, and it goes to the maximum facilitation, because if maximum facilitation does involve infrastructure, checks or controls, it would be unlawful under the provision passed yesterday, and therefore it cannot happen. I will intervene. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady, and then I'll give way to the Right Honourable and learned gentleman.
Very much. Just on that point, you're right, we didn't get to debate it, of course, because we ran out of time yesterday, but it's huge, because it actually says, I think, logically, we will have to come to a customs union agreement, partnership, love dance, don't care what you call it, but that's what we all need to avoid any... I'll do that. Any border at all in Northern Ireland. It's great progress.
Absolutely.
I'm grateful for that intervention. It is a very, very significant amendment. It was a very significant amendment in the Lords, even as amended, which takes it back to closer to the wording of the Phase 1 agreement. It is still very significant. I'll give way to the Right Honourable and learned gentleman.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. It also goes further than that, doesn't it? Because not only will we have to stay in a form of customs arrangement amounting to a union, but we're also going to have a high level of regulatory alignment, because otherwise the life that takes place along the border will be impossible because of different regulations on either side.
I agree, and I will develop that argument, because a customs union on its own does not solve the conundrum of how do you keep to the solemn commitment to no hard border in Northern Ireland. I will give way. I'll give way twice.
Repeat what my two honourable friends have said, because I was about to make the same point. But it was the most significant thing that happened yesterday, but in the circus that surrounded everything and the timetable that stopped us debating it, nobody so far has taken any notice. It does bear on today's debate, because the legally binding commitment yesterday extends the needs of the Irish border to the whole of the United Kingdom. So we're talking about Dover. And we settled that yesterday. And we're not having a border down the Irish Sea, so the United Kingdom has got to negotiate an arrangement with the EU as a whole, which has no new frontier barriers. So effectively, we are going to reproduce the customs union and the single market, and the government will not be able to comply with yesterday's legal obligation unless it does so.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I have to say, speaking for myself, when the Phase 1 agreement was reached in December, it was that commitment that I thought that was the most significant thing that had happened since the referendum in terms of indicating what our future relationship with the EU would be, because I think it is clear to everyone who's considered this and visited Northern Ireland and talked it through that the only answer to no hard border in Northern Ireland in the end is a customs union and high-level single market alignment. And that's why it was so significant. And I will just a minute, but the fact that yesterday that was accepted by the government and turned into domestic law gives it a status it didn't have until yesterday, because it was a political agreement at an international level. I'm not saying it wasn't solemnly entered into by the government. I'm not suggesting that for a minute, or that they would resile from it as a matter of international negotiations. But it now becomes a matter of domestic law, and that probably is the most significant thing that happened yesterday. I'll give way because I promised to, and then I'll give way behind me.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. May I just remind him that not only at the referendum, but during the general election, the vast majority of people, 85% of those who voted to leave the customs union and the single market. It was a very, very clear result. But could I ask the Honourable Member this one simple... Could I ask the Honourable Member this one... May I ask the Honourable Member this one straightforward question for clarity? In the opposition's search for a customs union, its wish for a customs union, is the opposition willing to sacrifice our ability to negotiate trade deals outside the EU in order to achieve that customs union with the EU?
Well, we all want new trade deals. At the moment, we've got an excellent trade deal with the EU. We've got 37 additional agreements with 67 countries through our membership of the EU. And the first thing we need to do is preserve that. Because I think I should deal with this. Lots of things have been said about new trade agreements and how they will be fast and we'll get much better terms than countries would offer to anybody else in the world. They'll be queuing up to give us preferential treatment, and quickly. I think the BrExit Secretary said that by the time March next year came, we would have had trade deals with countries geographically 10 times the geographical size of the EU. Well, he's only got a few months left to pull that one off. I think on this side, we consider that if new trade deals are struck together and jointly with the EU, we have a better chance of quicker and better trade deals in that. I promise I will give way behind me, and then I will have to make some progress. I'll give way here, and then I'll give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. On Monday, I was in Ireland with the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. What happened yesterday will be very welcome, I think, across the island. But can I remind the House that the issues around many things that happened in Northern Ireland over the last 40 years did not arise necessarily because of a border. They arose because of civil rights discussions around the island. And the House must be mindful in discussing those issues that we need to be careful about talking our relationship across the islands, both north and south, and within the United Kingdom as we go forward in these discussions.
I'll respond to that, and then I promise to take further interventions. But I do think I'll just answer that intervention, if you don't mind. But this is a matter I know that everybody across the House is really concerned about, on both sides. The commitment to no hard border in Northern Ireland that was there in the Good Friday Agreement was not just a question of technically how might you get people or goods over a line in the road. And nor is it as we go forward. That is not the question. How do you get goods or people over a line in the road between the Republic and the North? It is the manifestation of peace. And I had the privilege to work for 5 years in Northern Ireland for the Policing Board, implementing some of the Good Friday Agreement. And by talking to both communities consistently in that 5 years, I know that it is deep in the hearts of everybody there. This is more than a technical issue. It goes absolutely to the heart of what was achieved 20 years ago. We must always bear that in mind. I promise to give way behind me first, but I will try to get as many as possible. I'll give way here.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and he speaks absolutely the truth and with eloquence about the importance of preserving peace in Northern Ireland and of the centrality of the border to that. And he also says that we've got to effectively be in a single market and a customs union in order to achieve that. Would he accept that one of the concrete ways in which we might deliver that is to be in the customs union and the EEA, which is entirely possible, as Michel Barnier pointed out yesterday?
Thank you. I do assure my honourable friend I am going to come to the EEA and I will take interventions on it. I want to deal with the customs union first. I promise to give way to the honourable lady.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful indeed to the right honourable gentleman to allow me to intervene upon him. He has referred, quite rightly, to his service to the people of Northern Ireland and work through the policing board in earlier years. I am aware that the right honourable gentleman actually visited Northern Ireland quite recently and met with the present Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. He therefore will be aware that the Chief Constable has very recently withdrawn from sale 3 unused border police stations and has asked for funding for an additional 400 police officers to deal with the border arrangements after Brexit. So could the right honourable gentleman throw some light onto why on earth would the Chief Constable be doing that if we're not going to have a hard border?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I did go to Northern Ireland and I did have a meeting with the Chief Constable, who I know in any event. We spoke in confidence and therefore I will not break that confidence. But the facts, as you've just laid out, are right about staff and about posts and buildings. And there is obviously a concern that although no hard border is a political commitment in December and now a legal commitment, there is a concern that that is delivered on. And that's not a concern solely of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It's a concern across the piece. I'm going to take just one and one behind me, then I really am going to press on. I keep saying it, and I've got to do it.
Grateful to right honourable gentleman. Can I just bring him back to the point made by my honourable friend for Billericay? And I understand his answer as it tailed off is he's only in favour of trade deals severally and jointly with the European Union. Is he not aware that currently the EU has trade deals in operation with under 10% of the world economies? Is he saying that under Labour's vision we would not be able to secure trade deals with that other 90%? And would his vision also include the fact that at the moment 4/5 of the tariffs collected under the customs union are paid to Brussels? Does he want to see that sort of arrangement continued under his vision?
Yes, Starmer.
Can I just deal with that point? The EU has trade deals with 67 countries through 37 agreements. It has a further 49 agreements with developing countries. There are 200 countries in the world. There are 28 in the EU. 67 have already in extra agreements with the EU, and 49 in the developing country agreements. That is a considerable number of countries in the world. Now, I'm going to give way once here and then behind me.
I thank my right honourable friend. And would he not agree with me that the crux of today's debate is whether we want a close working relationship with our neighbour and our social, cultural and economic partner, the European Union, or whether we don't? And ultimately, what it also means is that is why so many of us want a customs union, whether that's the business community, whether that is the trade unions, and so many honourable and right honourable members on this side of the House.
I'm grateful for that, and I do agree. But can I just... I just want to finish. No, I don't think anybody could accuse me of not having taken intervention. I've got to make... I need to move on.
I'm extremely grateful to the right honourable gentleman. There was a less than wholly polite chunter from a sedentary position. I do warn the honourable gentleman for Wyre Forest I might have to have a word with family members of his who live in my constituency who would expect him to behave in a seemly manner from a sedentary position. And I simply say to the Shadow Brexit Secretary that I'm listening to his disquisition with great interest and will do so, but I know he will be sensitive to the fact that although we have 6 hours for debate, there is a very large number of members wishing to contribute. Sir Keir Starmer.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Just to conclude the point on Northern Ireland, in the end, the conclusion, I think, of the vast majority of people who've considered this at great depth and with concern is that there is no way of delivering on the solemn promise that there should be no hard border in Northern Ireland unless the UK is in a customs union with the EU and there's a high level of single market alignment. And the so-called backstop argument that's been going on in recent weeks is testament to that, because what the government is trying to do is to find a post-implementation period phase when, in truth, it'll be in a customs union and in high-level regulatory alignment with the single market. So, Mr. Speaker, for our economy and to enable us to keep our solemn commitments in Northern Ireland, I urge honourable and right honourable members to vote to uphold Lord's Amendments 1 and 2. I now turn to the EEA and the amendment tabled in my name and the name of the front bench. I can understand, Mr. Speaker, why their lordships have become so concerned about the state of negotiations that they wanted an amendment to cover the single market. The Prime Minister's red lines of October 2016, in my view, were a profound mistake. If we are to keep our duty of protecting our economy, both the manufacturing sector and the services sector, and keeping our solemn promise in relation to Northern Ireland, we need a customs union with the EU, and we also need a strong single market deal based on shared regulations and shared institutions. I will give way.
I thank my friend for giving way. Could he explain to me what... Sorry, Angela, I'll do more if that's okay. Could you explain to me what the tangible difference will be if we are in a customs union with full access to the single market as opposed to membership of the EU, other than we won't be electing members of the European Parliament?
Yes, obviously, politically, we won't be in any of the institutions, and we won't be a member of the EU. What we're dealing with today is whether we should have or shouldn't have a close economic relationship with the EU going forward. And that is a critical issue, I think, that everybody recognises, and working through what is the best configuration for that. But the mere fact that there's been a vote to leave the EU, I don't think can be interpreted as a wish of anybody voting to make our economic relationship with the EU any worse. I don't think anybody was voting to harm the ability of businesses in this country to do business going forward. I'm going to press on, and then I will give way. I'm just going to press on, and then I will give way again, of course. The EEA, Mr. Speaker, has a number of real benefits in regard to shared regulations and shared institutions, but it does also present some real challenges. I've taken this option very seriously, and I went to Norway to discuss it with political leaders over there, with trade unions over there, and businesses over there. And in the course of that visit, I also visited an EEA border, the Norway-Sweden border, to see what it is like. The EEA undoubtedly works well for Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, but their economies are very different to ours, as is their size. Norway is 5 million people, Iceland is 300,000, and Liechtenstein is 37,000. Those countries chose not to be in a customs union with the EU. EFTA is, after all, a free trade association. And those countries have, in fact, struck trade deals in their own right as a group. Those trade deals, I'm sure, work well for them. But I think the trade deals that the EU has struck, the 37 trade deals, work better for the UK than, as I can see, the EFTA trade deals would work for the UK. I'll just complete this. The EEA excludes agriculture and fisheries. And going back to my previous point, that does present a problem in relation to the solemn commitment to no hard border in Northern Ireland. I'll just complete this. I'll just complete this part, and then I will give way. When I went to the border between Sweden and Norway, there was infrastructure, there were checks, and there were controls. Not for people, but for goods. Well, exactly. So the EEA also provides very little flexibility on the 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement, and on the way that single market rules are implemented. Now, I'll just make this point and then I will give way. Some say these challenges can be overcome, and I will continue to listen to those arguments. But there is no doubt, or because there is no doubt, that in addition to the customs union with the EU, we do need a strong single market deal. But I don't think that we can ignore those challenges. I said I'd give way, and I will.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. And despite the small size of the populations of the EEA countries, such as Iceland and Norway, nevertheless, those 2 countries represent the 2 biggest catch sectors in the fishing industry in Europe. So if the exclusion of the common fisheries policy is so bad in terms of membership for the UK, then how on earth is it that Iceland and Norway, which depend heavily on fishing, are still in the EEA and benefit from it?
I'm obviously not making my point in the right way. What I was saying was, if the question we're trying to answer is how do you ensure no hard border in Northern Ireland, it's very difficult to see how you can answer that by adopting the EEA model as it is. Because agriculture is outside of the agreement that Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein have struck. Now, that was the point I was trying to make, and I make it again. I'll give way over here, and then I'll give way behind.
Well, it seems to me that, in effect, he's making the same argument as the government on this issue, that we want to go and negotiate a free trade deal without the bureaucracy and without the regulations, in other words, to have the best of the EU and the single market, but without the downside. So that's a very valid position to take, but can he now confirm that he is in concurrence with the government's position on this?
Not making the government's not the same position as the government at all. I'm recognising that we need a strong single market model. All I'm saying is that I think there are challenges in the EEA model, which is not the only model, and that we would be better off with a model that doesn't tie ourselves to a particular deal that another country has done, but a model, and this is why our amendment is important, Mr. Speaker, a model that ensures full access to the single market, no new impediments to trade, common rights standards and protections as a minimum, underpinned by shared institutions and regulations. That is a long way from the government. A long way from the government, because it's those commitments that they're not prepared to sign up to. That is why the frustration in the negotiations is that nobody yet knows, because the Cabinet is still divided, on whether the government really wants to negotiate something which is close economically to the EU, which requires shared regulations and shared institutions, or whether it wants to negotiate something else altogether. I will give way, but
Might I underscore, I hope all of us who support Brexit wish us to have an access to the single market on the terms we have now, with the conditions about regulation that will follow from that. One of the key things that was a part of the campaign was that we should also have control of our borders and that we wouldn't be subjected to foreign courts. Does he accept that we might have to pay for that privilege if we were actually going to gain free access to a single market, but control our borders?
I accept that freedom of movement was bound up with the referendum, and that is why every time I've stood here I've said that we accept that freedom of movement will end when we leave the EU. The question is, what comes next? And what does that look like? And how do we negotiate that with the EU? Now, that does not make it easy, but I think the government's approach, which was to abandon any argument for the customs union or the single market at the outset, for fear of having that discussion with the EU was wrong in principle. I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I absolutely agree with him. When we leave the European Union, the freedom of movement should end, and it's what comes next. But does he agree with me? The EEA, Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland model does not allow us to have control over how freedom of movement will change in the future. It ties us in to no say, and that is what Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland have signed up to, no say over freedom of movement.
Well, I've looked very carefully at the provisions in the EEA agreement, and there's been a lot of discussion about two articles in particular, Articles 112 and 113. I have to say my reading of those articles is that they are what's called in extremis provisions, which do allow some flexibility on all the obligations actually under the EEA, but only in extreme circumstances and for a short period of time. I think the argument that other people put to me is that there is a different interpretation, but that's a matter that we're still discussing. I'll give way once more and then really am going to get on.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the EEA only becomes a viable option if Britain were able to negotiate fundamental changes in the EEA agreement, and would be a huge challenge for the United Kingdom to adopt?
I think in fairness to those that are advocating the EEA, there is a recognition that the EEA as it is and unamended would not be the right deal for the UK. I think in fairness the argument is that it could be amended. Now I'm going to press on because, Mr. Speaker, I've used up far too much time. So our amendment does put forward a strong single market proposition. It sets out the kind of new... I can be accused of many things.
I say very courteously to the honourable lady member for Chelmsford, we cannot have intervention by what I would call proffered chunter from a sedentary position. If the member who has the floor wishes to give way, it's open to him to do so. And this blame game taking place between the honourable members for Wantage and Wyre Forest as to who chuntered, each pointing at the other, is not altogether seemly. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to press on. I've taken lots and lots of interventions. I've engaged in them. I've been on my feet for 45 minutes. That is not fair to other colleagues across the House who want to speak. The amendment that we've put on the table is a strong single market proposition. It sets out the kind of new relationship we want to achieve with the EU, a close economic relationship with full access, ensuring there's no lowering of common standards and protections, and recognises that shared institutions are required to achieve that. It's a million miles from where the government is on the single market. It doesn't set a narrow route, it sets parameters of the new single market relationship which we want to achieve, and it leaves options open to achieve that. And I urge all members on all sides of the House to support it. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the question of human rights and other protections. I first turn to Amendment 4, which sets out enhanced protections for employment, equality, health and safety, consumer, environmental rights and standards. And the argument here is very simple. It was very simple at the start and it's very simple now. At the moment, these rights have enhanced status because we're members of the EU. As they get converted, and they are being converted, the government said they would convert them and it is converting them. I'll come to the Charter in a minute. They are being converted into our law, but not with any enhanced protection. All this amendment seeks is that if those rights and protections are to be changed, that should be done by primary legislation. It's not contentious. It's not even saying the government can't change those rights. It's just saying if you believe in these rights and you think they should have enhanced protection, for heaven's sake put them into a form that means that if you want to change them, you've got to do primary legislation to do it. And the only reason I can think for resisting that is that somebody thinks it might be a good idea to chip away at these rights without doing it through primary legislation. Well, the Solicitor General shakes his head. Well, if not, accept the Lord's amendments, then get on with it. It's the same argument we've been making since this bill started life back in September of last year. And there is a good reason to be concerned. I know these are old examples, but they are real examples. The Foreign Secretary has complained of back-breaking EU workers' rights. The Honourable Member for Surrey Heath has claimed that the government should have the potential, if necessary, to rescind employment protections after Brexit. These are just examples that give huge cause for concern on these benches and to trade unions and working people across the country that absent the enhanced protection, these rights will be vulnerable. I will give way.
Most grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and he makes a very powerful case, and I can tell him that there should be concern on these benches about this matter as well. It is perfectly possible to carry out Brexit, to not incorporate the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which I know is a subject of difficulty, but at the same time he will agree with me to secure these rights in a perfectly sensible amendment which appears.
For that intervention, I would have thought this is not controversial. The Prime Minister said she did not want to reduce these rights, and we take her at her word. But if you convert them into a form where they lose their protection, you make them vulnerable. And I would have thought any government that wants to change these rights would have the decency to do it by primary legislation so that the proper scrutiny can be gone through in this House. It's very, very straightforward. I do turn then, Mr Speaker, to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Thousands of EU provisions are being converted through this bill into our law. Only one of them isn't. Only one of them. All the others, it's thought, can be converted, changed, modified, brought into our law in some shape or form. The Charter apparently can't. That is wrong in principle. I will give way.
I'm very interested in the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman's point, particularly on the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Does he agree with me that amendment in Loose C, which talks about the environmental principles and potentially rights being put into primary legislation, could leave us in the anomalous position where we have more environmental rights after Brexit than we have social and civic rights? And is that not a disgrace?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and my honourable friend makes the case very, very well and very powerfully. So far as the Charter is concerned, it has. I'm just going to make the point about the Charter, and then I will give way. The Charter has enabled the evolution of important rights, adding significantly in the fields of equality and non-discrimination, especially LGBT rights, and to the rights of children, workers and the elderly. As Liberty, Amnesty International and the Equality and Human Rights Commission have argued, excluding the Charter from the bill will lead to a significant weakening of the current system of human rights protection in the UK. Mr Speaker, human rights develop over time. This country and this House have played a long and distinguished role in that development. Brexit should not be used to end that tradition or reduce our human rights protection in the UK. We therefore call on honourable and right honourable members across the House to vote for amendments 4 to 11. I come now to the environmental provisions briefly. That's Lord's Amendment 3, which seeks to maintain environmental principles and standards as we leave the EU. That amendment has our full support. The EU's environmental principles are hardwired into the treaties, and they underpin all of its environmental policies and laws which are then enforced by EU institutions and agencies. These environmental principles and the enforcement mechanisms that uphold them must be retained and replaced if Brexit is not to weaken protection for our natural environment. I know there's an amendment in lieu tabled by the member for West Dorset designed to address some of those concerns. And if it's supported by the government, and I assume it will be, it does make some helpful developments to the government's policy, including proposals to enable the watchdog to initiate legal proceedings. But it does not go far enough, and we therefore urge members to support Lord's Amendment 3.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
Does he agree with me on that point, that the amendment as it stands only asks the government to have regard to, rather than acting in accordance with, which is a much less stringent legal test, and whilst it creates the ability to initiate legal action, it does not provide a legal remedy or access to justice for UK citizens?
I'm grateful. I agree with that, and that's why I say it's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough on its own, and there needs to be more. I turn finally to the question of refugee family reunion. I'm pleased that this amendment is before us today, and I want to pay tribute to Lord Dubbs for his tireless campaign on this. Labour supports Lord's Amendment 24, which is real and long overdue. We recognise some concern has been raised about the scope of family reunion that qualifies under the government's clause, and I'd welcome any clarification from the Minister on that issue. But in general, Labour will support this amendment today. So in conclusion, Mr Speaker, the amendments before the House today address crucial issues and along with Labour's single market amendment would be a huge step forward, both to improve the bill and to protect jobs and rights. And I hope honourable and right honourable members will support them today. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. The question is that Amendment A to Lord's Amendment 51 be made. I call the Solicitor General, Mr.